At 2:40 in the afternoon on a Sunday in early May, a 33-year-old hiker named Peter Hollis stepped past a weathered wooden sign reading, "Danger, bridge out, do not enter," walked to the edge of a washed-out crossing deep in a side canyon of the Grand Canyon, and started across a 40-foot gap on a fallen log that had been lying there, exposed to sun and flash floods for at least 2 seasons. He made it about halfway. The crossing sat in a narrow, technical side canyon, accessible from a lesser-used trailhead on the Grand Canyon's more remote north side, a spot that years earlier had a simple wooden footbridge spanning a 40-foot gap where a seasonal wash cut across the trail, dropping roughly 60 feet to a boulder-strewn creek bed below. The bridge had been destroyed the previous monsoon season, torn out by a flash flood powerful enough to snap its support posts and carry most of the structure downstream in pieces. The National Park Service had closed the crossing immediately afterward, posting reflective "Do Not Enter" signage at both approaches, and had, in the time since, been working through the lengthy process of funding and scheduling a full rebuild, a process complicated by the crossing's remote location, requiring materials and a crew to be brought in either by helicopter or an extended pack mule trip. In the meantime, hikers determined to complete the loop trail that the bridge had once served were left with essentially 2 options: a lengthy, multi-hour reroute along an alternate trail that added significant distance and elevation gain to an already long day, or the unauthorized option that a small but steady number of hikers had apparently been choosing instead: a large, fallen cottonwood log spanning roughly the same gap the bridge once crossed, positioned there by the same flood that had destroyed the bridge, or possibly dragged and wedged into place afterward by earlier hikers looking for exactly this kind of shortcut. The log had never been inspected, tested, or approved by anyone. It had spent well over a year exposed to sun, temperature swings, and at least one additional flash flood event, all of which contribute to the specific kind of internal wood decay that is often invisible from the outside. A log that looks solid with intact bark and a stable-seeming diameter, while the wood fiber inside has been steadily weakening. Peter Hollis was 33, an experienced backpacker from Colorado with a decade of trips across multiple western states, including 2 previous visits to the Grand Canyon. He was fit, confident on technical terrain, and by most measures a genuinely capable outdoorsman, not the profile of hiker most people picture when they imagine someone ignoring a clearly posted safety closure. He was 3 days into a 5-day solo backpacking loop when he reached the washed-out crossing that Sunday afternoon, tired, well behind the schedule he'd mapped out before the trip, and acutely aware that the marked reroute would add close to 4 additional miles and nearly 1,500 feet of extra elevation gain to a day he'd already been hiking for over 6 hours. He had enough food and daylight to make the reroute work. It would simply mean a considerably longer, harder remainder of the day than he'd planned for. He stood at the closure sign for several minutes, a detail later confirmed by the 2 hikers who would soon become involved in what followed, who watched him from a distance as they approached the same junction from the opposite direction. He appeared in their account to be weighing the decision seriously rather than dismissing the warning outright. He examined the log from the near bank. He tested its stability with 1 foot before committing his weight, in what looked to the approaching hikers like a genuinely careful assessment rather than a reckless one. The log held under that first test of partial weight. It gave no visible indication from the surface of the internal decay already compromising its structural integrity. Peter started across, moving deliberately, arms out for balance, pack still on his back, a detail that would matter considerably in the minutes that followed, since a loaded backpacking pack shifts a hiker's center of gravity in ways that make any recovery from a loss of balance significantly harder. Sarah Kessler and Tom Whitfield, the 2 hikers approaching from the far side, reached the near bank of the crossing just as Peter was passing the halfway point, roughly 20 feet out over the 60-foot drop to the creek bed below. They called out to him, a warning or simply a reaction to seeing someone mid-crossing on a route they knew, from the same posted signage, to be closed. Peter, according to both of their later accounts, glanced toward them, said something to the effect of "almost there," and continued forward. He had covered perhaps 3 more feet when the log gave way beneath him. The break happened at a point roughly 2/3 of the way across, at a section of the log that Sarah would later describe as showing, in the instant of the snap, a cross-section of wood that looked more like crumbling, water-damaged pulp than the solid timber the exterior bark had suggested. Peter dropped as the log's far section fell away beneath his feet, but he did not fall the full 60 feet immediately. He managed, in the same fraction of a second, to grab the remaining, still attached portion of the log, the section still anchored to the near-side bank, catching it with both arms as his body swung down and struck the canyon wall below the crossing point. He was left hanging, roughly 20 feet below the trail level, gripping the broken end of the log with both arms, his boots scrambling without purchase against a rock face too smooth and too steep to offer any foothold, some 40 feet of open air still beneath him to the creek bed below. He was screaming for help. Sarah and Tom, on the near bank, could see him clearly. What followed was close to 30 minutes of 2 hikers with no technical rescue training, no rope, and no rescue equipment of any kind, trying everything available to them to keep a stranger alive. Tom's phone found a single bar of signal at the very edge of the crossing, enough to place an emergency call to Grand Canyon Dispatch. He gave their location as precisely as he could, while Sarah moved to the edge of the gap, lying flat on the ground to extend her reach as far down toward Peter as possible, without putting herself at risk of going over as well. Neither of them had rope in their packs, a gap that, in the moments that followed, both would later describe as the single thing they wished most they'd been carrying. What they did have was a length of paracord Tom used for gear repairs, nowhere near strong enough to bear a person's weight, and 2 sets of trekking poles. They tried extending the trekking poles down toward Peter, hoping he might be able to grip one while they pulled, an attempt that failed almost immediately. The pole's thin shafts and locking mechanisms never designed to bear a hanging person's weight, one pole's section separating under the strain the moment Peter tried to grip it. Sarah talked to him continuously through this entire period, not with any specific training in how to keep someone calm in a survival situation, but with the basic human instinct to keep a person's mind engaged and keep them fighting rather than letting panic or exhaustion take over. She asked him about his trip, about where he was from, about anything that might keep him talking, keep him focused, keep his arms locked around that log rather than giving in to the burning fatigue that any person's grip strength faces within minutes of bearing full body weight in a static hang. Peter's arms were visibly shaking within the first 10 minutes. By 20 minutes, Sarah could see his grip beginning to slip incrementally, his body sagging lower against the log with each passing few minutes, his responses to her questions growing shorter, more strained, more focused entirely on the physical effort of simply holding on. A Grand Canyon technical rescue team, dispatched by helicopter given the remote location and the severity described in Tom's call, reached the scene a little after 3:10 p.m., close to 30 minutes after the initial call, a genuinely fast response time for a location this deep in a remote side canyon, made possible only by the helicopter's ability to bypass miles of trail that any ground team would have needed hours to cover on foot. The team's approach, once on scene, focused on the fastest, technically sound method available, rappelling a rescuer down from the canyon rim above the crossing point on a fixed rope system, rigged as quickly as the terrain and available anchor points allowed, to reach Peter directly and get a harness or rescue line onto him before attempting any lift. This process, even executed as efficiently as a trained team could manage, was not instantaneous. Setting a safe, load-bearing anchor system in unfamiliar rock, calculating the correct rope length and rappel angle to reach a hanging victim 20 feet below and out from the rim, and beginning a controlled descent all took several additional minutes, minutes that by this point in the incident, Peter's rapidly failing grip strength could not comfortably spare. a rescuer reached him within roughly 6 minutes of the team's arrival on scene, an extraordinarily fast technical rescue by any professional standard, and still, in the specific physics of what Peter's arms had already endured over more than 30 minutes of continuous static hang, potentially too long. The rescuer reached Peter and immediately began working to clip a rescue harness and safety line onto him, talking to him steadily throughout, trying to guide him through the specific movements needed to help secure the connection, movements that required Peter to briefly shift his grip, adjust his body position, and cooperate actively with the rescuer's instructions, all while continuing to support his own weight against a log that had already been holding him for over half an hour. Peter attempted to comply, shifting his weight as instructed to allow the rescuer to route the safety line around him. In that moment, mid-transition between his own failing grip and the harness not yet fully secured, his hands lost their hold on the log entirely. The rescuer, positioned close enough to attempt a direct grab, managed to catch part of Peter's pack strap in the same instant, a desperate, split-second intervention that held for perhaps a second or two before the strap tore free under the sudden weight, unable to bear the full force of Peter's fall even momentarily. He fell the remaining distance to the creek bed below. The rescue team, already on scene and equipped for exactly this kind of technical evacuation, reached him within minutes, but the fall from that height onto the rocky creek bed below had caused injuries that were unsurvivable. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Sarah and Tom, still on the rim above, had watched the entire final sequence unfold from the edge of the gap they had spent the previous half hour trying, with everything available to them, to keep from becoming exactly what it became. Every piece of what happened to Peter Hollis traces back to a single decision made at a clearly posted sign, weighing a genuinely difficult trade-off, a known, safe, but significantly longer reroute against an unauthorized shortcut across a structure nobody had inspected or approved. He did not make that decision carelessly. He tested the log. He assessed it as best his own judgment allowed. It simply wasn't enough information to detect the internal decay that a log's exterior appearance, even to a careful and experienced hiker, cannot reliably reveal. Once the log broke, everything that followed, Sarah and Tom's improvised, courageous, ultimately insufficient rescue attempts with nothing but paracord and trekking poles, a technical rescue team reaching the scene in a genuinely fast 6 minutes once on site, a rescuer close enough to nearly complete the harness connection before Peter's grip finally gave out, represented close to the best possible response available at every single stage, given the tools, the terrain, and the time actually available. It still wasn't enough because grip strength under sustained static load has hard physiological limits that no amount of encouragement, improvisation, or rescue skill can extend indefinitely. Do not enter signage at a washed-out crossing is not a bureaucratic formality standing between a hiker and a shorter day. It exists specifically because a structure behind that sign has already been assessed as unsafe by people with the training to make that determination. An assessment that, unlike a hiker's on-the-spot visual check of a fallen log's exterior, accounts for exactly the kind of internal, invisible decay that made Peter's careful, deliberate test of the log's stability meaningless the moment his full weight committed to the far half of it.